Hi, and welcome to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum. My name is Maria, and I'm one of your 3 Athenaeum Fellows for the year. Disney Pixar's latest film, Turning Red, features main character Mei-Lin Lee, a 13-year-old Chinese-Canadian girl experiencing the trials and tribulations of family, growing pains, first crushes, and the chaos of puberty. Early on in the movie, May's mother incorrectly believes that her daughter has started her period, resulting in a loving, if not overbearing, sequence where the mom presents her daughter with a hot water bottle, ibuprofen, vitamin B, and an assortment of pads and tampons. This scene, which delighted many viewers, also raised a lot of criticism. Parents took to Facebook and other social media platforms to decry the movie's discussion of menstruation. Some claimed the scene had instilled intense discomfort in fathers who didn't want to hear any period talk in a movie with their family. Others said that their sons, of any age, should not be subject to hearing about pads, crying that it had traumatized them. And some even claimed that the movie was sexualizing 13-year-olds and embarrassing them by including a 30-second discussion of menstrual hygiene options. In the United States, the average age of a first period is 12, though more normally it ranges between the ages of 15. Do young kids not deserve to see a normal and important part of puberty normalized on screen? Questions like these are central to the work and activism of tonight's speaker, Jennifer Weiss-Wolf. In her book, Periods Gone Public, Taking a Stand for Menstrual Equity, Weiss-Wolf challenges readers to face this stigma head-on and to elevate an agenda that recognizes both the power and the absolute normalcy of menstruation. A frequent writer and advocate on issues of gender and politics in America, Jennifer Weiss-Wolf was dubbed the architect of the U.S. campaign to squash the Tampon Tax by Newsweek. She currently serves as the inaugural Women in Democracy Fellow at the Brennan Center for Justice at NYU Law. And in 2022, she joined Miss, the feminist movement-making magazine, where she serves as executive director for partnerships and strategy. Weiss-Wolf is on the board of the Feminist Press and the editorial board of the Fund for Women's Equality, Equal Voice, Equal Future Initiative. In 2015, Weiss-Wolf conceptualized and co-edited a volume of legal change, lessons from America's social movements. Her book, Periods Gone Public, earned starred reviews from Publishers Weekly and Library Journal, as well as the Washington Post. In 2021, Weiss-Wolf organized the Brennan Center series, Abortion is Essential to Democracy. Her forthcoming book, Period, Full Stop, The Politics of Menopause, will be published by NYU Press in 2024. In addition to her book, Weiss-Wolf's thinking has also been published in the New York Times, Los Angeles Times, the Met Time, Newsweek, Cosmopolitan, Teen Vogue, Marie Claire, Glamour, Harper's Bazaar, and NPR, among others. She holds a JD from the Benjamin N. Cardozo School of Law, where she was editor-in-chief of the Cardozo Women's Law Journal. Ms. Weiss-Wolf's Athenaeum presentation is co-sponsored by the McGrublian Center for Human Rights at Claremont McKenna College. You will also notice a copy of Miss Magazine at every place setting. But before we begin, we have some housekeeping to go over. Given the recent shift in public health conditions, all guests must wear either a KN95, N95, or surgical mask during the programming indoors. If you do not have one, please contact me or the other ATH fellow here tonight, and we will find one for you. At this time, please ensure that your mask is properly fitted over your nose and mouth. Please also silence and put away your cell phones, and remember that, as always, video and audio recordings are strictly prohibited. We also ask no eating or drinking while indoors. We will have a Q&A period at the conclusion of the talk, and Athenaeum staff will distribute box dinners for all registered guests. There will also be a book sale and signing at the back of the room at that time. Now, without further ado, please join me in welcoming Jennifer Weiss-Wolf to the Marian Minor Cook Athenaeum.
So great to be standing behind a microphone on a podium with people. It's been a long time since doing in-person events, and I'm really, really, really grateful to be here. I love that introduction and that you brought in that movie, Turning Red, as it's a a modern opportunity to talk and think about menstrual stigma. And I'm really extremely eager for your questions, thoughts, comments. So I'm going to I tend to talk a lot. I do an unscripted piece here, but I'm going to, if you can wave to me at like 30 minutes, and that way I can, we can sort of see where we're at, and I would love to open it up for conversation. I find, especially when talking about menstruation, that there's never a time that I don't learn something from what the kinds of things you're thinking about or the questions people have. So I really actually want this to be as interactive as possible, because I could talk for hours and hours and hours, but I really actually want to have a full-on dialogue and hear from all of you. And I'm really glad that you opened with a pop culture example too. I'm a lawyer, as you heard, and I'm a writer, and I largely think about change through the lens of policy and systemic reform, and often a bit of law tied in there. But it's really, really important actually to think about sort of all of the cultural influences when we're trying to make full-on societal change. And I think that's what we're talking about when it comes to menstruation. It's not enough just to change policy. It's not enough just to change laws. We really actually have to change hearts and minds and how we view each other in society and think about equity and equality in the most holistic, organic sense. But I'm gonna tell a little bit of my story, because I think that I talked to the group from Curious earlier, and I said there aren't too many people, I think, who grow up thinking they want to be a lawyer and what they really want to focus on is menstruation. And quite honestly, neither did I. But I did go to law school knowing that I wanted to focus on gender equity and women's rights. But it took till much later in my career, till I was 47 years old, for this issue to cross my doorstep. And it's almost kind of strange to me now that I've been so consumed with it for about 7 years to remember a time when I didn't think of it, or it wasn't sort of part of how I looked at the entire world, but it's true, and it found me very accidentally. And I don't know for other folks here who are thinking about the issue tonight or who are involved in activism or advocacy, if your story is the same, that it found you accidentally, that you really hadn't thought about it till you heard it, and then you said, oh my gosh, how did I never think about that before? But that was what happened to me 7 years ago, where there were 2 kids in my town where I was living who announced that they were doing a collection drive of tampons and pads for our local food pantry. And they had sort of like a little flyer that they'd put up explaining why the food pantry needed these items for their clients, why they didn't have a budget to cover them, and why they were doing this collection drive. And I seriously, the time stopped as I remember back at that moment. I just couldn't believe this was a piece of knowledge that I didn't have, and it's something that I hadn't considered before, and I just immediately had to know more. I signed up to contribute to their drive, and we still have these pictures of a party we had where everybody brought, tampons and pads as their price of admission. But truly, because of the work that I do at the Brennan Center for Justice, I think that might be an organization folks here know. It's a think tank affiliated with NYU School of Law, and just sort of being somebody who is drawn towards policy as a driver for change, that was really where my mind went. Okay, sure, I can provide these kids with however many boxes that I'm able to collect, but what does this actually mean? What is this saying about our society? That this is a need that a food pantry has identified and doesn't have any sort of systemic support or structure to turn to meet it, other than, in this case, it was an 11 and a 14-year-old who were like pounding the pavement to collect these products. So I wrote a piece at the time, and I wasn't actually a writer at the time. I'll finally now call myself a writer. But at the time, this was still sort of new for me. And the piece had the magnificent fortune of being placed in the New York Times. And it really was able to start a big conversation, much bigger than I ever expected was going to happen. And this was 2015, and people weren't talking, even with a Pixar movie and conversations like this, that really even wasn't the norm then, 7 years ago. And as I was starting to do early research on what a policy agenda might look like, there was really little to draw from. Interestingly, the only other time that menstruation has been a matter of public policy in the United States was going back to the 1990s, when there were a spate of deaths and illnesses from toxic shock syndrome. And Congress had some hearings to determine if there needed to be stronger regulation of tampons in particular, and it yielded very little. It yielded a slight FDA modification and an attempt by then, or still Congresswoman Carolyn Maloney, to introduce legislation mandating transparency and certain degrees of product safety in tampons. And do you know that legislation has never passed? It's never even gotten out of committee. So here that was 2015, and I was thinking, well, what is a modern menstruation movement policy agenda going to look like? And lucky for me, I started actually hearing from policymakers even before I started kind of really figuring out what that agenda might look like. So in real time, I had the kind of, it was a very unique experience to be working with members of Congress, to be working with several state legislators, including here in California, and including in New York, as well as municipal government leaders, including in particular the New York City Council, to start mapping out in real time what it would look like to make menstruation a matter of political discourse and a matter of policy change. A few ideas came to mind quickly. At the time, again, we're talking 2015, other countries were addressing certain issues. One of them is one that I bet you folks here know, the Tampon Tax, the fact that menstrual products are often not exempt from sales tax when other necessary items are. And that was a fight that was being waged at that time in England, in Australia, in Canada, where they actually succeeded in the summer of 2015 of eliminating their national goods and services tax, which is their national sales tax on menstrual products. And that was among the policy ideas, excuse me for water. That was among the policy ideas that seemed, sort of like a live place to start, a reasonable place to start, a place where I imagined we could bring in bipartisan support, that there would be people who veered right of center, who would see benefit to having the state eliminate its interaction with its citizens and create a financial incentive, that there would be interest on left of center because that people would see it as a social justice issue, a gender equity issue. But interestingly, in New York City, where I lived at the time, the city council, which doesn't have any oversight over sales tax, really wanted to dig in on access. And that became sort of a template and a model for the country, the work that we did in 2015 to determine which agencies would be the ripe ones and the right ones to consider menstrual access, and to turn that into both a budget item and a policy agenda. So that's kind of the start of the story for me. There were opportunities to push state legislation. There were opportunities to push federal levers for menstrual access, and then there was this sort of, kind of grand, broad opportunity in New York City. And I know there's a group of students here who are looking at now municipal and citywide efforts to ensure menstrual access. So it's actually kind of an amazing full circle to be, it's this group over here who I was chatting with outside, to know that agenda has already sort of become such a natural and normal part of the infrastructure of how we think about policy reform, how we think about this as being something that should be a mainstreamed issue. The sales tax issue, I think, is one probably most people are most people familiar with that, the tampon tax, getting nods. I can do a little bit of background, but going back to 2015, at that time, 40 of the 50 states here in the United States did not exempt menstrual products from sales tax. And of the 10 states that did, 5 just had no sales tax at all, and 5 just included menstrual products in some random umbrella, but there was no sort of distinct or deliberate momentum to consider this as a reform. So this was kind of a new agenda here in the US when this kicked off in 2015. Like I said, other countries were addressing the issue, but what was distinct and different about pushing for that policy reform here is that it has to be tackled state by state. The federal government does not have any oversight of state sales tax, and states can make their own decisions about what is taxed, what isn't taxed, and how those dollars are used to support the financial needs of the state. So it meant that here it was going to be a 40-state campaign. It wasn't going to be, there wasn't anything Congress could do, there wasn't anything the president could do. This meant going to 40 different state houses and 40 different governors to get it done. I was part of launching a petition I'm going to get a little like kind of weeds policy wonky here, just about advocacy ideas for all of the current and fledgling policy advocates here in the room. But to me, it was really important that this not be considered in the echo chamber or vacuum of state by state, that there needed to be sort of a national a national call and a national shaming, if you will, of states that weren't getting it done. So this needed to have sort of a national level discourse, even though it had to happen and it was going to look different from state to state. So the petition called on all 40 of those states and all 40 of those governors and all 40 of those state houses to tackle and take on this reform. California, I have to say, was after, so that petition was launched, and as I was telling the group earlier, another sort of strange occurrence, unlucky occurrence, was that Cosmopolitan magazine wanted to partner on this with me. And it was kind of one of those very humbling, like, sure, I'll do that with you. My 2,000 Twitter followers, your 3 million Twitter followers, this seems like a good marriage. So Cosmopolitan was very eager to sort of put themselves in the throes of a policy campaign. And it picked up a lot of signatures, and it generated a lot of discourse and interest. By early January 2016, I'm going to keep telling this in kind of a linear way because that's kind of how it makes the most sense to me. So hopefully this is all something that's easy to follow. But by January 2016, California was the first state out the gate introducing legislation to eliminate sales tax on menstrual products. You may know that California the legislature passed a bill in 2016. And then Governor Jerry Brown vetoed it. I don't know if folks know that. And it took 4 more years to get it moving in California. And now it's the state of play. I'm not going to say it's the law in California because it was only written into the budget. So meaning when the next budget has to be negotiated, and I think that's 2023, it has to be renegotiated all over again. So not ideal, but better than nothing. But California was actually first state out of the gate to introduce legislation and pass it in 2016, but it didn't see it over the finish line. And then in early 2016, had the sort of also good fortune in the world of then President Obama being asked this question. I don't know if anyone remembers that. It was a YouTuber, and he was asked in some youth tour that he did about the tampon tax and weighed in prolifically about it and profoundly about what representative government looks like. But that was sort of enough to set that issue, off to the races. So between the work that was being done in New York City at the time to mandate menstrual products in the city's jails, in the city's shelters, and in the city's schools, and the tampon tax sort of catching wind with California out, introducing legislation first, the President of the United States speaking to it, and then sort of a whole host of states following. We've seen basically over the course of this, that was 2016, so this is now sort of the end of the 2022 legislative sessions, we've seen kind of almost unprecedented momentum for a political issue and a policy issue that had almost no legs and no discussion here in the United States before 2015, other than a basically failed attempt in the 1990s to mandate menstrual product safety, to now more than 13 states mandating the sales tax, sales tax exemption for menstrual products. And really, for the policy wonks in the room, interestingly, some states have done it through legislation, some states have done it through budgets like California, some states have even done it more wisely through their budgets such that it doesn't have to be reintroduced, but it has to be taken out going forward, so it's almost as good as a law passing, Rhode Island, and even the state of Nevada doing it through a ballot measure. There have been dozens of states, and I can't even give a precise number because it almost changes by the minute, of states that have and municipalities that have mandated menstrual product provision in everywhere from, again, like New York City, the schools, the shelters, the jails, to their state prisons, to public libraries, to public buildings, public facilities. Even that Congress has passed 2 pieces of legislation. There are only 2 menstrual access provisions that have ever passed, and they both passed with a Republican-led Senate and a Republican in the White House in 2018. And I don't say that sort of to fuel any partisan flames, but it's just otherwise it's a little surprising. You wouldn't expect to see that, and I think that's one of the extraordinary aspects of this movement is that there is such universal interest and determination to see this through and to push aside what is ages-old stigma and things that might otherwise seem like sort of unlikely bedfellows to come together and acknowledge and understand that menstruation really does stand apart, and that menstrual access is something we need to be talking about, and that by not talking about it, we've caused, we've seen harm and disparity and inequity. But Congress passed 2 pieces of legislation in 2018. The First Step Act, I don't know if there are any criminal justice folks in the room, but that is a prison reform bill and a sentencing reform bill, and it includes provisions about conditions for people who are incarcerated, and it mandates menstrual product provision in federal prisons. And there's never been any other such mandate on the books federally. And then in 2020, when the pandemic started, Congress passed fairly quickly in March 2020 a stimulus package that was very, very wide-reaching, and it included, among other things, a provision that, about to get wonky here again, the IRS tax code, the way it's classified menstrual products always has been not as medical products, as personal grooming items, and there's an outcome. There's an impact to that kind of classification, among other things, for people who use federal spending programs like flexible spending accounts or health savings accounts, where you can put pre-tax dollars aside to have, to get more bang for your buck when you need to buy medical necessities. Menstrual products were excluded because of that classification. So the CARES Act was an opportunity to remedy that. And that was rooted in legislation that had been introduced for a variety of years, throughout Congress, in different terms of Congress. So all of which is to say, I've kind of raced through that, but is to say that over the course of the past 7 years, the idea that we need to put menstrual stigma aside, that we need to talk openly about menstruation, because after all, half the population experiences menstruation for a good portion of their lives, and that we've left that out of our policy making is an extraordinary, it's worse than an oversight. You know what I mean? It's an exclusion that has caused damage, and it's a way to look, I think, through that lens at the world and say, what else have we missed? What else have we missed? If there are things we're afraid to talk about, if there are aspects to gender equity, if there are aspects to social justice, if there are aspects to all of the ways we live, racial equity and health equity included, what are we missing when we don't talk about the things that we're somehow told we're not supposed to talk about? It's not just that people feel ashamed and embarrassed or it's stigmatized, and that is not a small thing. But it's that we miss the opportunity to have a fully inclusive and equitable democracy, to have laws that reflect the way all of us live, that reflect the experiences that we have, and to ensure that we're able to participate fully, fairly, and it's interesting to me because when I first stepped into this issue, I wouldn't have thought of it as a matter of democracy or a matter of justice. And it seemed to me to be a matter of, equity, fairness. But the more and more I came to think about it and bring sort of all the tools to bear that exist in the work I do on voting rights at the Brennan Center, at the work I do on storytelling at Ms. Magazine, that menstrual equity and menstrual access is, of course, a matter of democracy and participation and engagement. So kind of just shared a lot there. That was like freewheeling here. That was free thinking. I would actually love to take a pause, and I would love to hear your reactions, your questions, your thoughts, your ideas, whether it's the group that's working on it, what's everybody in the room. I have no idea if I just went for 20 minutes or 10 minutes or 30 minutes, so please fire away. I would love to have a discussion with all of you. But that's not the end. I want this to be the start. I feel like there's just so much you all have to say and that I'd love to be responsive to.
Just as a reminder for our students, please line up behind one of the 2 microphones. We'll take a few people, observe social distancing, and introduce yourselves.
And please also feel free to share stories too. A group of us met earlier, and I was really blown away by some of the stories and perspectives people shared. So I would love, really nothing is off the table. I'm really pleased to hear all of it and talk about all of it.
Hi, I'm Sydney. Thank you so much for coming and for your work on this issue. My question is, what has the pushback you've gotten looked like?
That's a great question, and I'm going to share like a silly story before I say that. I was contacted at one point in time by one of the comedy shows. I don't remember if it was like Trevor Noah or Samantha Bee, and they said, we need an opposition voice because we're doing a segment on this and we can't find one. And I was so pleased to hear that, that nobody wanted to be the person who stepped out and had something negative to say. And I really lean into the bipartisan piece of this. I've worked with legislators across the aisle, and there really is something for everyone here. I mean, maybe it's surprising because our politics are so polarized now, but it's not surprising because all of us sitting here in this room know how universal this experience is, whether we're a person who experiences menstruation or not, like somebody in our lives did, I promise you, there's something about it that just draws people in. One of the things we were talking about earlier too was that there's almost something like quietly subversive about it, because it's not subversive, it's natural and it's normal. Yet because it's been off the table, you feel kind of tough when you come in the room talking about it, because you know you're doing something that everyone just hasn't necessarily done. I mean, I do it a lot now, obviously, but it's a very empowering avenue of activism, and I've found that it's an extraordinarily brilliant, generous, energetic community. So the only real pushback, I would say, and this is policy pushback, not people who think they can't talk about menstruation ever, is budgets. So there's often, I mean, we know this in all the ways, you know, in every single issue, there's always the reality of what the fiscal constraints are. And I'm very, very dogmatic about ensuring that it is not carried on the backs of the people who are most marginalized and least, and should be the least likely to have to carry it. Excuse me. So an example of how that's played out, and I give this as a talking point for all of you who are advocates and activists in this space too, is oftentimes, like, that'll be the first question asked: what is this going to cost? How are we going to manage this expense? And the first time that I ever heard that asked was back in 2015 in New York City, and the council member who had led this initiative happened to also be the chair of the budget committee, so that made it very easy because she had control of the city's budget. So there wasn't ever a question this was going to be written into the budget because it was her decision. But she would get asked that question, and she would sort of say in this perfect, well-timed, almost like comedic answer, do you know what the city's toilet paper budget is? And has it occurred to you to ask what the city's toilet paper budget is? And inevitably, of course, the answer was no, because has anyone ever asked what the toilet paper budget is? But why would you ask that about this? I mean, maybe because it's new, but obviously because there's some notion that, like, this is extra, this is something we really didn't need to be talking or thinking about, was it? And that was always just kind of like a showstopper to ask that question, and to realize if we're not asking that question in one instance, we owe it to our city and to the ability for everybody to succeed to not ask that question about menstrual products. But cost is definitely the place where governments usually find that they're going to be challenged. And again, for the policy advocates in the room, try really hard not to get an unfunded mandate in anything that you ever get passed, because it becomes a lot harder to enforce. And so managing it into the budget. Interestingly, in New York City, I'll share too, because of the position of this council member, we probably got around having to do things like cost-benefit analyses and other, sort of fiscal exercises that responsible governments, can and should ask for. New York City got to, it's off the record, it got to sort of evade that a little bit in the first go-around, but it provided a proof point and a data point, which of course also doesn't really exist in this policy space because it is so novel. That's helped to pave the way for other policy reforms when you can now point to how it's being done, what the outcomes are, and to make the case too that sometimes outcomes can be qualitative as much as quantitative. So whereas we don't necessarily have to prove it's keeping kids in school, we can tell stories about how it's improving their experience.
Thank you.
You're welcome. Doesn't sound on.
It's on. No.
There we go.
Oh, yeah.
Dramatic pause, okay.
Hi, I really enjoyed your talk. My name is Joyce. I'm actually from China, and back in 2019, I founded this nonprofit, and we have been providing thousands of girls in rural China, like one of the poorest area in China, in Sichuan, with pads for over 2 years now, and also underwear. And during my process, this whole program, I feel like the biggest challenge I face is probably because I've been in China, and I face a lot of challenges from the government's silencing, you can say, especially with the introduction of Chairman Xi's extreme poverty elimination program that was launched 2 years ago. And so, for example, when I was writing an article after I donated the stuff to one of the places, it was like an 8,000 word article, and the government, like the Women's Federation of China, would ask me to like delete half of the stuff because I could not mention poverty in my program. But my question is, like, if I cannot mention they couldn't afford pads, why am I giving them the pads? So I feel like it's really important for me and my organization to use the power of medias. And I want to ask, what are the biggest challenge you have faced when negotiating with the government, and how have you pushed through the legislation, and how important do you think it is to use the power of the media to mediate period poverty and period shame?
Two of my favorite questions. I'm going to start with the power of media, because I am a big believer in the power of media. And that includes all forms of media. That includes social media, that includes traditional media, that includes like specific audience media. And interestingly, that first experience with Cosmopolitan was one of my first times working with sort of like a popular women's magazine. And I don't know if folks remember this, because I think it was in 2016, or the lead up to the 2016 election, that Teen Vogue sort of broke out as a like sort of high power political reporting machine, and was doing actually in some cases more hard hitting reporting than sort of the core national newspapers and international newspapers that we were relying on, that we especially now in hindsight can see where they were falling short. So this was a little bit before the women's magazines kind of entered the space of being, sort of political narrators too. And it was kind of extraordinary to learn how to tell stories for different audiences, to think about, who is going to read it. I mean, there are places with huge followings that are sometimes a little bit unexpected. And it shouldn't be unexpected that women's magazines would be a good outlet for telling this story. But it was also conservative outlets. It was also places just focused on different aspects of cultural life. So I became really committed to doing that kind of storytelling. And I made a joke earlier that people don't often think they really want to read about policy, and their eyes tend to glaze over when you say you're about to talk about policy. So I would always joke that it was like putting spinach in the brownies to get my kids to eat them. Like I would sneak it in. So I would sneak in policy too, and people wouldn't realize they were suddenly wrapping their arms around a policy solution when they thought they were just sort of reading something that presented like a clever story. So I still do that kind of writing, and I've loved you all have Ms. Magazine at your table. Ms. Magazine is something that I've been reading since I was a kid. It's 50 years old. It came out in 1972, and it's feminist storytelling and journalism. But I really love to apply this kind of, I sort of have a wide filter of where I think stories should be told. I'm not so great on social media. I think that's past me, but using sort of different traditional media outlets, to me, is a really important way of elevating the discourse and then catching the interest and attention of lawmakers and other people of influence, and then showing them when they're going to step out on these issues. I mean, this is their career. They need to be shown that it's important, that people are talking about it, that their constituents want this, that the public's going to have their back, that they're not going to somehow misstep. So media is a really important way of just framing a story and getting people to catch on and talk about it that way. So that's the answer to your second question. In terms of legislative, again, back to sort of what's the hardest or what's the legislative pushback, I think one of the things that's been hard, especially recently, not in the early years. In the early years, by that I mean 2015, 2016, people couldn't get enough of this. It was like they struck gold. They found something that everybody could talk about. It felt important enough, but not too important, which is not to undermine it. But you know what I mean? It had like a little bit more just had like a popular energy to it. I think since the pandemic, it's been really hard to keep people's attention, to convince them that this still rises to the top of concern, that this is still something that sort of on the micro level impacts people in their daily lives, and on the macro level is an important way of talking about gender equity and thinking about what we don't think about, and what, by not thinking about things, what we're leaving out of our lawmaking. So I was especially excited when the CARES Act included that provision around the IRS tax code and classification of menstrual products, because it showed that, one, in a time of crisis, economic crisis, racial crisis, health crisis, menstruation still mattered. It wasn't a little thing we could put off to the side, that it's absolutely integrated. And two, that tax reform, while not sexy, is an important way to make social change. So we went back to the states after the CARES Act passed and said, see, doing the tampon tax, getting rid of sales tax on menstrual products matters now more than ever. It's not like there's more important fires to put out, but in fact, this is integral to everything else you're doing. So I'd say the hardest thing now is keeping people's attention. And again, in this especially this past state legislative session that's been so polarizing and so shameful in so many ways, seeing what's been happening and who's been left behind and who's been undermined, whether it's education law, whether it's trans inclusion, whether it is abortion. I think that keeping this live and relevant and integrated and as inevitably part of all of those discussions too is a really big challenge, but it's a really important challenge too that I think we're all positioned to rise to.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Miss Weiss-Wolf. I really enjoyed your talk, and I'm curious whether on the tampon tax issue or on other issues of menstrual equality, you were talking a lot about your strategy and kind of this name and shame strategy for the 40 different states that hadn't, repealed the tampon tax. I'm curious if the judiciary came in at any point as part of your strategy.
Thank you. And I know this man who's a wonderful person I've known most of his life. But and I love that question. And that wasn't a planted question, and very few people actually ask that question. And so when I started doing this work, I was thinking about it solely through a policy lens. I was not thinking about legal arguments, and I was not thinking about constitutional arguments. I happened to cross paths with a litigator in 2016 who was desperately wanting to bring legal claims. And in fact, so this was 2016, when she was in Columbia Law School in 1993, she wrote a memo about sales tax and menstrual products when she just sort of inadvertently saw it on her receipt one day, and it made her very frustrated and angry. So she found me once this policy, momentum took hold, and said, what would you think about a lawsuit making a constitutional claim that failing to exempt menstrual products from sales tax is an instance of sex-based discrimination and violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment? And I said, bring it on. That is amazing. And I had never thought, I'm a lawyer, but not that kind of lawyer. So my brain hadn't gone there. So we teamed up with a law firm in New York City, and we found 5 plaintiffs, and we brought a class action lawsuit against the state of New York claiming that they were engaging in sex-based discrimination. The lawsuit did mostly what we thought it would do, going back to the question about media, because we kicked up a firestorm of media about it. We had a press conference with, bags of, candy and whatever things. I did the list. Now I can't even riff on it, but all the things that are not exempt that are exempt from sales tax, and it ranges, from fruit roll-ups to barbecued sunflower seeds to, golf club memberships. It's crazy. But so we did like a show and tell with the media, and the lawsuit caused then Governor Cuomo to say immediately, "Bring me the law, I'll sign it," and the legislature passed it, and the governor signed it. So we mooted out our own case very quickly. But we really did want to test this argument. So it took 5 more years, and actually also in sort of this context of the pandemic, we brought another lawsuit in Michigan in 2020, right? Not 2021, 2020. And we made the same constitutional argument, but we sort of raised the stakes by saying it's also extremely important to be acknowledging this in the context of the harm that people are, and the economic and social harm that people are experiencing in the pandemic. And the other piece that we did in that lawsuit that was a little different in New York, and it's partly just because as this movement evolved, more voices came into the fray. But we've been working a lot with trans and non-binary folks who were very concerned about, writ large, how sex-based discrimination claims are brought, because they force you to actually talk and think in a gender binary. So we worked with the ACLU's LGBT project to create proper footnotes, and that's a thing. I'm sure you all know that, but in a legal brief, that's a thing too, so that we could make the case for the first time that bringing a sex-based discrimination claim around the instance of menstruation did not require the court to have to look at it through gender binary. And we were really proud of that because, it didn't cause a grand judicial ruling, but that's how law starts to change. You have to plant those seeds. So we wrote articles and we wrote academic pieces and then planted it into the brief. Michigan too, with its all-female leadership team, Secretary of State, Governor, and Attorney General, and it's a very contentious legislature, managed to pass legislation. The governor signed it, but this time we did not voluntarily dismiss our case. We want to see the legal claim through because we're also asking for damages on the part of the state to repay back taxes to everybody in the class, through which, by the way, we're gonna, if it happens, and I don't have too much hope that it will, but if it happened, that we would create a fund that then people could, they could decide not to collect their $8 or whatever it comes to. And remember too, the tampon tax isn't just about the dollars and cents, but it's a larger equality and equity argument. But then that fund would be used to, to support other menstrual access initiatives in the state. So that's the answer. And there are plenty of other claims too. There's Title IX claims, there's other education law, there's pregnancy discrimination law. There's a lot of laws that can be tapped for judicial interpretations about how they apply to menstruation, and I'm totally in for it.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi, Ms. Weiss-Wolf. Thank you so much for your talk. My name is Annie, and I'm a senior at CMC. I'm standing up here because I was really inspired by your story about running into the food pantry drive and how that sparked a shift in your career and a pivot that led you into a new direction. I was really curious because as students, I feel like we're often called to work towards policy reform because we're passionate about certain issues that we identify with. And if we're exiting college and we feel very pulled towards a career with a promising financial compensation, or we want that sort of stability of a career, or maybe we're not working towards policy reform and we're in some other career that we're not as passionate about, how do we balance that pull to try something new, to pivot towards what we're actually passionate about? And how did you yourself evaluate the risks and the benefits of that opportunity?
I love that question. Thank you so much for answering that. And I'm going to give my story as an answer. I know generations are different, and I know times are different, and I know the things that people are fearful of and concerned about are different, but I can only give my story and the advice that I give my own kids, who are all young adults as well. So when I graduated from law school, it was an economic recession, and I wanted nothing more than to be a crusading women's rights lawyer. I wanted to sit in Ruth Bader Ginsburg's chair at the ACLU Women's Rights Project. There were no law jobs available there at the time, and they said, would you like to come here and work in our development department and think about sort of just more of institutional structure of this organization? And I said, yes, like that I put that at a higher premium than practicing law at the time. So that was my first job out of law school, was doing foundation grant writing for the ACLU's Women's Rights Project and Reproductive Freedom Project. By the time, and I'm gonna get really personal here, by the time my first kid was born, I found managing work and life impossible. I found that nobody was happy and everybody was stretched to their limits. So I made the decision, just like I made the decision not to practice law, the next, controversial decision I made was to step out of the workforce. I stepped out of the workforce, and sorry to keep calling you out, Grant, but you're the only person I've known for a long time here in this room. I opened a store. I opened a children's consignment store, and I brought my legal skills to bear because I franchised it. And I created a store, and I made 10 other stores and enabled other people to sort of live life on their balance. And I didn't have childcare. I dragged my kids to work with me every day because I could, and that was how I wanted to do it. By the time I went back to the workplace, I went to legal services for New York City and came to the Brennan Center in 2010. At the Brennan Center, which is an extraordinary organization, I hope if folks don't know about it, you can have a chance to read about it. We think always about reforming and revitalizing our systems of democracy and justice, and we think about it in sort of a three-pronged way. We think about how to bring scholarship to bear, how to bring legal advocacy to bear, and that includes policy advocacy and litigation, and how to bring communications to bear, storytelling, thought leadership, shifting the media narrative. And I really bought into that model, hook, line, and sinker. So by the time this menstruation issue found me, and I'm telling you, it found me. I wasn't looking for anything like this in my life. It was January 1st, 2015. If anyone reads the book, you'll hear the whole story about that I was a polar bear swimming in the ocean and had all this adrenaline, and then stumbled onto this thing on my Facebook while I was posting the pictures of this swim. And it was really cold to swim on New Year's Day in Coney Island, I'll tell you that. So I was proud to post those pictures. But it was an epiphany, and my life has never been the same. So there is not a regret in that career path. And I was 47 years old when I started writing for the first time. My daughter once made a remark to me that it was so neat to see, Mom, no matter how old you are, you can still find your passion. And that was definitely meant as a backhanded comment. And my response to her is, well, you're never too young either. So my advice to you and to all of you, and thank you for that question, is to trust yourself, trust your instincts. If you walk into something that you know is important, have no fear. When I first started writing about this, the very first thing I did is I sent my ideas to a columnist at the New York Times, a person named Nick Kristof. I don't know if people still read him. He's not there anymore. And I was so sure that I had a truly remarkable thing to discuss that I just wasn't afraid to reach out to anyone. I thought they would be lucky to hear from me because they too could have their mind spinning like mine was at this point. And I wish that for everybody. So I would say just, there are a lot of conventional rules, and it's okay to step aside from them. It's also okay to follow them. Sometimes they, take your time. Not everything has to be done in one day. Not everything has to be done in one decade. I feel like as a lawyer and a writer and as a parent and as an advocate, I've been able to have it all truly, 54 by this age, because I just waited, and sometimes it just wasn't the right time. But when I knew it was, I trusted myself. And you know what, the other thing I tell my kids all the time, I have a 99% miss rate, okay? So I put a lot of stuff out there that doesn't stick. It's okay, you send an email, someone doesn't answer it, you have not ruined their day. But never be afraid to follow your instinct. Be bold enough to talk to people about the things that matter to you, they'll feel it. And again, you can completely buck conventional wisdom, but you don't always have to. You don't have to be a renegade either. And I feel really fortunate. And you asked something that's really personal. I've really enjoyed being able to answer this. The Brennan Center is a very elite and esteemed institution. And I would dare say they've learned a lot by having me in their ranks too. Somebody who's afraid to, push convention and ask different questions and try different techniques, but to not be afraid of any of it. So I hope that's helpful, and I hope that wasn't too personal or rambling of an answer, but I'm really glad to be able to impart that, because I know, especially for those of you who are seniors now, these are really intense times. Lots of you graduated high school in a pandemic, lots of you are graduating college in what we hope is the end of a pandemic. We've had really volatile political experience in this country for the past 5-6 years and before that, and it's scary. I totally get it, but it all can be true at the same time. And for those who really can't, you need that job, you need that salary and that path at first. That's all great too. You can do writing on the side, you could do advocacy on the side, you could do activism on the side. Your job isn't everything. So that's all my career advice.
Thank you so much.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. My name is Genevieve. I'm a senior here at CMC. I'm a big proponent of reusable menstrual products like menstrual cups.
Mm-hmm.
I'm curious if you've come across that in your work at all, and if you see that they may become more popular in the future and may be an area for future legislation.
Yes, and we touched on that earlier today, and I don't remember if any, I can't see right now who was here from before, and I promised I would talk about that and didn't, so I'm glad that you asked that. So I have a couple of answers. On a sort of general level, I think that reusable menstrual products and a wide variety of menstrual products is essential, and we've had too few choices over the course of our lives. There hasn't been a lot of incentive for innovation. There are big companies who make big profit off of shaming periods and kind of forcing people into a corner to use certain products. So the idea that there are new companies and young companies and women-led companies and green companies all sort of giving us more choices is inevitably a good thing and a better thing. And I would say that about reusable products, although I'm really careful, and this is where maybe it surprises people, I'm really careful to be sort of prescriptive about any sort of discourse about this, because we carry enough baggage and burden around menstruation, especially for low-income people and especially for marginalized people. I would hate to put more burden on somebody to feel like, you know, this water bottle is okay and using that disposable applicator is not. That's too much on our backs, and we deserve not to have to carry that. There are many other ways and players and people who should be carrying that, aside from people who are menstruating and have enough to deal with. That said, though, the more we could do to educate people about reusable products, which are, you know, going to at some point be more cost effective and better for the planet, yes, of course we should. So it's all a yes and, it's not an either or. So that's sort of my policy answer around it. Keep touching that. And then understanding too, and this is important as we talk about global stuff too, and I appreciated the remarks from about advocacy in China. You know, there are standards and cultural and societal and religious and generational stories that people have throughout their lives about menstruation, and not all products are part of people's stories. So if using internal products is something that, you know, is not considered, you know, okay in your family, I would never want to be the person coming in saying, but of course you should be using a menstrual cup. Because it's going to be cheaper for you over the long term. It's going to be better when that goes against things that they might, you know, feel very deeply. So I think we all have to be sort of careful to be mindful just that these experiences are personal, that they differ from family to family, from society to society, from culture to culture, and just always being quite thoughtful about that and how we talk about all these issues.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hi, I'm Mia. I'm a freshman at CMC, and kind of going off of Genevieve's question, I was curious about, on the more controversial side, how sexual education plays into the conversation on menstrual products.
And that's covered in the book. It's something that I became really riveted by, and I'm forgetting the stat now of the number of states that require accurate sex education. It's something like frighteningly low, and so I've had this notion, and I've faced a lot of disagreement over it, and there's a chapter in the book, so if you have the book, you can take a look at it, where I thought it wise to divorce menstrual education from sex education out of real concern about how sex education is considered and implemented and treated, you know, from district to district and state to state, whereas menstruation is something that could not only have a little bit more objectivity to it, even with what I, you know, coloring it with what I just said before about, you know, personal experience, and thinking about it as sort of more of a quiet gateway. I mean, I have to say that I think menstruation, menstrual advocacy is a gateway all around to talking about bigger and broader issues, but so too is it when it comes to talking about sex education. And I was at a talk at a Planned Parenthood, I don't know if it was Planned Parenthood's National Federation or or the affiliate in New York City, but I got a lot of pushback from that. When people said, no, it's the other way around. This is the gateway to bringing sex education, and we shouldn't be separating them. We're marginalizing and stigmatizing other aspects of sex education by doing that. And I think it's another both and, because I think that's true in terms of how we engage and have, you know, sort of the kind of discourse that advances an idea or as a goal. But as a matter of policy, public policy, sometimes, I hate to say it, sometimes, you know, you have to sacrifice the perfect for the good. And I think that there is an opportunity to think about a broad array of ideas and issues that can be discussed when it comes to menstruation if we think about it in a slightly narrower way. And I realize that everyone doesn't agree with that, but that's kind of been my thinking. And I've also thought about menstrual product provision in schools is kind of a cheap opportunity to squeeze in some education. I hate that in New York City, which was where this law was passed in 2016, there is not any information about the products people are using on the machine. So I've been pushing, and we'll talk about this, I've been pushing the city council to include not just safety information, but to squeeze in, if somebody's never seen a tampon before and they have no idea that they're not supposed to use it for a certain amount of time, I do not want them being handed out in school without that information. But there's other information that could be tacked on that wouldn't have to be full-blown sex ed curriculum or even menstruation or health ed curriculum, but that could be part of that. The last thing I want to say is menstruation could be taught in schools in so many ways that are not just about health education. It could be taught in literature, it can be taught in social studies, it can be taught in science, it can be taught in math. We should think about just normalizing it, turning red style, to all the things we talk about. But there are extraordinary lessons that can be drawn. I can name literature where menstruation where it takes a front and center role, or at least can be discussed. But same is true for science. Same is true for many interdisciplinary discussions.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Hello, good evening, Ms. Weiss-Wolf. My name is Brandon. I'm a sophomore at Pomona, and I'm part of the task force team here. And I'd love to know, I have two questions for you. You're experiencing and shifting the language from feminine hygiene to menstrual products, and also taking an intersectional approach. If there's any policy or new research or any just innovations that you might know of that are helping menstruators who are immigrants or non-citizens, as well as those who are facing disabilities, because from my research, that's kind of been a lack in a lot of the research that I've been doing with my partner, Haley. So if you have any insight on that, I'd love to know.
Yes, okay, so first is language. Gender inclusive language, neutral language, factual language. Menstrual product is just what it is. Like it's maybe about hygiene, it's about hygiene in some senses. It's not necessarily a feminine experience for a variety of reasons. And we can talk about sort of gender more broadly, but between trans and non-binary folks, there are women who just don't menstruate, there are women who are too old to menstruate, there are women who cease their menstruation for various reasons. There's no reason to tie it to a gender experience. And some folks believe that as part of, it's part of their own essence and being, but it's also factual. So it's not that hard a push to get legislative bodies to say menstrual products. I'll be honest, and this is a totally pragmatic thing, if you beat them over the head about it, they'll start to back up a little bit. They'll be like, yikes, this isn't actually what I wanted to step in talking about. But if you just tell them to say menstrual product, because it's like less letters and more factual, and it's fine to say, they'll do it. And that's kind of another sort of advocacy lesson, and that goes a little bit with the good and the perfect. You don't have to communicate everything at every moment. Sometimes you just need to bring people in. And honestly, my age and stage in life, I need to be, and I write about it in the book, how I was brought in through friends of my own, through my kids' friends, through other advocates I met, and how it helped me to learn to be a better and more inclusive advocate, and then to help to help create a more inclusive environment among state legislators and in state legislatures. It's not perfect. Some do, some don't. Some legislators do, some don't. Some do it better than others, some don't. So it's all a work in progress, but I think that's kind of my answer. I don't mean to sound flip, but it's been a way to, it's been a learning curve for me, but I found that it's actually not as steep a curve if you depending on the approach. Does that answer your question?
Yes, thank you.
And then the other question was, immigration. So first of all, there's a really fabulous article out in Global Citizen today about just a bunch of advocates here in the United States who are helping to address the refugee crisis in Europe right now, and being part of the relief effort, ensuring menstrual products are at borders, are at food and other sort of places where people can go for support and services. Here in the United States, it's a broader. There are groups that focus on refugees. There are groups that focus on immigrant communities and think about those, both the sort of the need and how it presents itself possibly presents itself in distinct ways, and also thinking about being sort of culturally appropriate and relevant in those circumstances too. The experience that I've had has been in the policy move for corrections, detention and immigration detention sort of has overlapped with that, and that's generally those are federal centers. And there was I guess back in I don't remember if it was 2018 or 2019, when there was a crisis, at the border in Mexico. There was a lawsuit filed, and it wasn't actually about menstrual products, but among the examples given in the treatment of the teens and the kids who were being separated from their families at the border was denial or lack of access to menstrual products. So I wrote about it at the time to help sort of to draw attention to it. And within the members of Congress who've been involved in this, and it's mostly on that, there's some senators, but it's been mostly robust on the House side, they've been able to, without having to have legislation passed, in their various committees, make sure menstrual products and menstrual access are considered in the regulations. So one example, and this is not something that necessarily touches on immigration, but FEMA-funded shelters or emergency services are under the auspices of the Department of Homeland Security. And until a particular Congresswoman Grace Meng, who folks follow this know has been sort of a central champion for this in Congress, she was on the Homeland Security Committee, and she saw the list. It was just like a list that was passed around of what items recipients of these funds could use them for. It was like Band-Aids, sheets, I don't know, those are the two I remember, but it was like a long list, I don't know, maybe 100 items. Menstrual products weren't on it. So she wrote it in. And then his Secretary of Homeland Security was Jay Johnson at the time, stamped it and it was done. It was simple as that. So there are opportunities to make those changes, without having to engage in full-on legislative advocacy. But again, that's all part of the education, kettle of fish here. You have to keep telling these stories. You have to elevate these stories, because otherwise people don't know. You can't solve a problem you don't know exists. And the thing about menstruation is, so now people, they think about sort of these key policies. Well, we need menstrual products in schools. They don't really think about what happens when schools close because of the pandemic. They think we need menstrual products in corrections, but they don't think about immigration detention, or they don't think about police stations or other places where people might lose agency. It's everywhere. I mean, I promise you, maybe not like a traffic law, but if you look at any law, you could probably find a way to think about menstruation vis-a-vis that law. So I challenge and ask all of you to do that. Think about it, because you'll come up with new policies that haven't even been imagined yet.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you so much for your talk. My name is France. I'm a freshman here at CMC. I go through normal menstrual cycles, and as a part of those menstrual cycles, there are days that are more painful than others where I cannot get out of bed. What should professors and students alike do in order to bring up the conversation as to, I cannot go to class because I'm currently on my menstrual cycle, therefore I'm in too much pain to do anything?
Thank you for asking that. And that's so. I'm frequently asked that about workplace policy, so I'm going to sort of translate that over to, this is the place of a business, where you are a member. And so it's the idea of menstrual leave or time off for menstruation has often been considered kind of controversial or problematic. It's a common thing in parts of Asia. There have been attempts in Europe to pass period leave, as it's kind of colloquially called. It doesn't really come up to, it's not really emerged as a live item here in the United States. And I wrote about it in the book that a lot of the experience that either companies that have implemented it themselves or countries that have implemented laws requiring it it's had a mixed reception, as you could imagine. You know, there's a notion that it's making it easier to discriminate against women or somebody who has for whom menstruation poses, you know, potential, you know, disability or inability to participate in the workforce. That it makes it easier to marginalize, to discriminate, either against that person or against, you know, the class of people who would menstruate. And even in some of the policies, they have a genesis or an undercurrent of not only sort of protecting the weaker sex, but trying to ensure that people are sort of left whole for reproduction. So there's a lot of insidious stuff that accompanies it that makes it tricky. So that's the policy answer. My policy answer for here in the US was that there are current laws on the books, the Americans with Disabilities Act, Family Leave, Pregnancy Discrimination Law, that could probably be tapped to be inclusive of menstruation and provide protection. But that's not really what you're asking, because you're asking how you have that conversation and normalize that conversation. And by that, I'll say for all the students and professors here, is just start normalizing it. To say it with clarity, to say it with conviction, to make clear what you are capable of, and that you're capable of doing everything except for being present at that moment. I honestly think about it sort of in the context of when I think about mental health issues as well, and I think about physical health issues as well. The little analogy I always say in my head is, if somebody had a broken foot, I would never say to them, hurry up. And we have to learn to apply that to all of these other conditions that we're less comfortable and less fluent talking about as a society, as a culture. So I guess that's the best answer that I have. It's something to bring to the administration as well. A lot of students have brought menstrual product availability or accessibility to the administration. It's something perhaps to also bring to the administration, especially as we've seen during COVID. I don't think anyone desires to be on Zoom all the time, but we now know that it's possible to participate in workforces and in education and daily life in a variety of ways. And I think that's the feedback I've heard about menstruation and pregnancy, for that matter, during the pandemic, was that people were able to manage it in ways that caused them a whole lot less distress, emotional, mental, physical, than when they had to just be present and act like everything was fine. So I think that if there ever was an avenue or an opening to do that, now is actually the time, as we're learning to sort of live in a hybrid world. So I hope that's helpful, and I'll think about that some more.
Thank you very much. It was actually very helpful.
Okay. If there are more questions, I'm happy to take them. I promised you, I told you, listening to me ramble is way less fun than having the back and forth. So I'm not always so linear, so I like the questions a lot because a lot of good stuff can come up. So if there are questions, bring them on.
Hi, I'm Madeline, and I'm also on the task force. We're writing a report about menstrual equity. And I just had a question about how you see city-led initiatives as an avenue for menstrual equity reform, and why city-led initiatives have been more successful than any other type of reform?
So that's an excellent, excellent question. And as you know, much of the policy architecture for this movement here in the United States started in New York City. It's funny because people will bring up Scotland as an example quite often as that's a national bill. That must be better. That must be more important because it's national. And my answer to, and Scotland has a free period products bill, and I'll tell you what is better about Scotland's bill is that it acknowledges all of these different equity concerns we've talked about and makes it so that people can just seek out these products on their own. It doesn't require having to go to a government building. It doesn't have to require being registered in school or being incarcerated. It just acknowledges that life is complicated and life is hard, and they've created a voucher system. So for some people, it's because they can't afford it. For some people, it's maybe that because it's not safe for them to go access it. And we can talk about that after, what some of those safety issues look like. But Scotland being a national initiative, there was a lot of flack, gosh, why is the US so far behind? And so I had sort of a three-pronged answer to that, which is, one, Scotland is half the size of New York City. Two, Scotland is a much more sort of homogenous, not only more homogenous nation, but like a governance that is simpler. We have a more complicated governance system here with the different roles and responsibilities of state governments and Congress and the federal government and municipalities, and even beyond municipalities, like local communities and university communities and state university systems. I mean, there's just myriad ways that we can engage. And because menstruation is something, I mean, it's important to have broad policy, and trust me, I've been pushing the President of the United States to talk about this and to have like we need a national leader to explain why this, like, everyone needs to rise. But it goes back to sort of that Tampon Tax petition. We need this national statement, and then we need the ground up, to make it happen. So cities and major cities are a really, really ripe ground for that. New York City has bigger population, bigger budget than many states. So what happens in a city like that can set the tone and learn lessons that can then be translated out and then realized in multiple other places. So Los Angeles has been a leader out front. Many of the counties up north around San Francisco and Berkeley and Santa Cruz in that area have also been. Chicago has been, I skipped the Chicago story, but if anyone wants to hear a good Chicago story after I told it earlier, and I'll share it with anyone who wants to hear it. But, and in cities, you sort of have an intersection of social service agencies, of school boards, and you have sort of just like a different sense of possibility in terms of granular knowledge about sort of the needs of people, but the opportunity to make wider scale, sorry, that's really, I talk with my hands and that's right in my hands, to make wide scale change. So I'm a huge, I mean, as somebody who started my own work in New York City, I see with my own eyes the potential of what city legislation can do to spark a movement. And I know that if you want to share the variety of cities that you're all working in, I mean, they're all cities that have sort of make a great melting pot of diversity in terms of cultural experiences, in terms of wealth of the city, in terms of the populations that coexist and commingle in those cities. I'll just say that in New York City, when I first started working at the city council, I very diligently made this great big memo that had, like 18 points and all the different things I thought the city could do. And we ended up agreeing that the Department of Education, Department of Homeless Services, and Department of Corrections would be the most receptive. And we really wanted a unanimous vote. We wanted it to be like a home run. So we didn't want to put anything in there that was going to be a distraction. So libraries, we've talked about, we didn't put in. The city has a free ID, New York City has a free ID card. I don't know if any of the other cities you're working with do, for undocumented citizens, and for residents, and for non-drivers. And I was a non-driver for a long time, so I had one of these ID cards. It's called City ID, and it's largely low-income people who need to obtain the City ID because they can't get a driver's license, and the City ID comes with all these other benefits. So one of the ideas I had was, well, why not have the City ID be shown for free menstrual products? But it was too complicated and not doable. So I would say that in addressing these cities, think really creatively about what they could do or what's unique to those cities, in terms of transportation that they use, in terms of just the public facilities and how they're managed. There was a huge move in Sacramento about public restrooms and the need for mobile public restrooms because there was such a problem with people who were unhoused, creating health issues because there were health issues created because there weren't public restrooms. So different cities are going to have different personalities and different opportunities. And I think that's a really important, that you're doing it sort of collectively so that you'll have, sort of this wide range, but don't be constrained by what exists out there. What exists out there is just what worked in some places, and it doesn't include what didn't work yet. So make what didn't work yet possible for for these cities where, what's possible in Mexico City might be different in Barcelona and might be different in Los Angeles. But it's like kind of the perfect laboratory for these kinds of changes that can then be translated over to state governments and potentially even to Congress, even though there's so many limitations as to what the federal government can do. So I think cities and major cities, and they're also sexy. Cities are like, people know cities, they know what they know about them, they have a favorite city. Barcelona is one of mine. So hearing that's happening there, it's really catchy. It's really, it tells a really, you know what I mean? You can get a lot of different kind of media and you know, public figures and influential people to think it's important if it's their favorite city, the city where they, you know, the city they know, the city they love, the city they're from. You get a lot of pride in cities. People probably, do you think that people have more pride in their city or their state? I don't know. It's a question. So think about how city pride there's tons of fodder. I'll talk to you more and more about it.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.